first of all, I mean, absolutely thrilled to be here in Montenegro. It's my first time, so it's an amazing place, and hopefully I'll find another good reason to come back. I think my slides are maybe, I've got to click all the way back through. So while I'm setting up, I mean, just to get a feel for the room. So who in the room is actually a founder of a startup? Okay, just a few hands going up. I think hopefully we'll see a few more hands going up in the years to come. And who is an investor or invests in startups? Okay, cool. Okay, good to know. What's everyone else doing? Who's in marketing? Okay, so a few more there. Okay, cool. So I'm going to talk today on a topic that I think is interesting for anybody, but is something that probably gets obsessed a little bit too much in the world of VC and startups. But I'm going to be talking about where will Europe's next unicorns come from. And by unicorn, I mean a tech startup that is valued at over $1 billion. It's a horrible term. It's one that actually makes me slightly nauseous because it gets overused so much. But I think it's a good proxy for, where are we going to find the next big companies and truly globally ambitious companies to come out of Europe. And why am I talking about this topic? I guess maybe for two reasons. So first of all, part of my background, about 8 years ago, I was there with 5 or 6 other guys in a small little coffee shop in Berlin, one of the up-and-coming tech hubs in Europe for startups, and we were building a company called SoundCloud. I left 5 or 6 years later. We'd actually gone from literally nothing, not even having a product launch, to being a company where we just raised our Series D. We were getting close to being one of these billion-dollar companies with a valuation close to that. So it was a really kind of inspiring journey to see that you could, just from a couple of guys in a room, build something such, so big. I guess the other way I see that now is through an investor lens. So last year I joined a company called Seedcamp. And what we do, hopefully some of you may have heard of Seedcamp. If you haven't, what we do, we're an early stage investor. So we actually try to find the founders who want to build these big, globally ambitious companies, and we provide them with very, very early capital. So no more than 200,000 euros, but usually when there's just a couple of people around the table, like we were in Berlin all those years ago. And I think it's not just the money that those people should look for. At Seedcamp, we also try and provide some support, provide access to network, provide some of the rails upon which the founders can really go and drive a big business. To find a unicorn, we have to be quite active. We're probably making around 30 to 40 investments every year. I think to date we have just over 211 numbers. I think that we just invested in some more last week, so that number's grown. Not all of them are active. Some have exited, so some were successful. Some are sadly no longer with us. And actually we had quite a lot of second-time founders, so they do that journey the first time around, they learn from their mistakes, and they come back and they're champing a bit to have another go. And I think one really important thing is, in the context of this talk, is we think that everywhere in Europe there are founders who have the ability to build big businesses. And I think John probably said it in his talk earlier that the Silicon Valley and the US don't have a monopoly on talent with which to build these companies. So we've spent a lot of time since we started investing in 2007 actually going and visiting many different local ecosystems all across the region and finding those kind of hidden gems, those talent, those ambitious people who want to build big companies. Even though actually probably the majority of our founders do come from some of the hubs, so from London or Berlin, we found a lot of success in places like Estonia, places like Lisbon. We're seeing a lot of upcoming activities in places like Spain. And actually speaking of regions, so given that we're here today in Montenegro, we have invested in quite a few companies from around surrounding countries. We have yet to find our first Montenegrin company, but maybe that will change. But we've invested in quite a few companies in Croatia, a couple from Macedonia actually, and also a few from Serbia. And just to pick out one really good case study, so I don't know if you're familiar with many of the logos there, but yes, you are, excellent. Truck Track, they actually presented here at this conference in 2013. They won the startup track here, and actually I was talking to the founder. I said, before I go on stage, you've got any anecdotes about your time? And he said, for him, actually, that was really his first kind of opportunity. It was his spark. And he was able to win tickets to go and present in New York at TechCrunch Disrupt. And for him, that was, the start of the journey. He suddenly realized, okay, wow, I need to get to US. I feel like I have the confidence to go out and raise money. and then C-Camp invested, and then he also has investment from 500 startups, and I think you guys will probably hear from Marvin from 500 startups tomorrow. So similarly, a company called Buildcon, again from Serbia, recently invested in them, and so has 500 startups. Cool, and why am I kind of, hopefully have some view on this topic? Well, we do have a couple of recent successes. We just sold a company called Holby to a bank called BBVA, and another company that we invested in back in 2009, I think it was, Stupeflix, just sold to GoPro. But I think the only unicorn that we have active in the portfolio right now is a company called TransferWise. We invested in those guys in 2011, and actually just this week, they just raised money at a reported $1.1 billion valuation. But two things to say on that. I mean, I think the people who see the kind of word unicorn bandied around, is for good reason. As an investor, our job is ultimately to kind of return money to our investors. So, when I came to this game, I was thinking, well, actually, if I build a business and I get to 1 million, or I get to 10 million, or I get to 50 million, that's a pretty good success. And those are great successes. They return some money, there's great experiences, the founders, do very well out of that. But I think the reason why investors are so obsessed with this term unicorn is it's just simple mathematics. So you take C-Camp as an example, we have a 20 million euro fund. If we sell a company for 10 million and we have maybe a 5% stake in that company, you can see it's going to take quite a lot of those before you're able to return the fund. So yeah, it was a surprise to me, but I think that's why people are so obsessed. Startup outcomes, especially when you're in a very high growth tech company, outcomes can be binary. So investors, for better or for worse, and I think some would definitely argue maybe sometimes for the worse, but you have to, as a founder, I think you have to understand that mindset of why the industry around startups and VC is so obsessed with this term. Cool, so where are we looking for the next billion-dollar business? Where do we think it's going to come from? Well, if we look at sectors to start with, we're actually very agnostic. So, as I kind of was preparing this presentation, looking back through the portfolio, I think there was definitely a couple of trends that emerged, in different phases. And it's really our job, as we're backing companies so early on, to be able to, it's usually us reacting to those trends, but we get a sense of them, and then we're able to build a thesis around them, and then probably back more companies who are kind of trying to jump onto that trend. So if you look, 2007, for us, we were seeing, I think in the US it was a lot about kind of social and Twitter and Foursquare and companies like that. For us in London, it was thinking more about e-commerce, enterprise, analytics, and we backed a number of companies in that space. Then 2000, 2014 was where we met and funded companies like TransferWise and Holby that I just mentioned, and we continue to invest in that sector through Revolut, Curve recently. And then down in the bottom right, there's a nice cluster around property, so prop tech. And we have, again, this horrible kind of thing where we have to take a word and then just put tech on the end of everything. But prop tech is companies that are really disrupting a very old and established business, so both in residential and commercial real estate. We think there's a lot of opportunities to be had in that space. And I think one of the interesting things here is, by definition, a unicorn is a complete outlier, right? But, usually they're not breeding in isolation. So usually you might see one trend or one sector that's actually really going. And not all of the companies are going to be successful, but as they're working on the same problems, as they're kind of developing new solutions to the same problem set, we see a lot of synergy. So it's nice in, at C-Camp, when we have so many companies in a particular cluster, we see them being able to exchange skills, exchange knowledge, which is a really, really valuable thing. Arguably, more valuable than just the money. And timing is everything in venture capital. It's very easy to get things wrong. Quite often, one of the in investing, being early is sometimes as good as being wrong. So you can see, with fintech, for example, back in it was either our selection or maybe it just wasn't the timing for that company to come to fruition. But you can also be too late to the game. So everybody's thinking about fintech, and I think there's still a lot of value to be built. But as soon as something becomes big, everybody jumps on the bandwagon. And in the last couple of weeks, I've had to look at about 800 applications that came through. And all of the fintech ones, there's a lot of Me Too products, so a lot of savings apps or a lot of banks for millennials. And while we can't dismiss them instantly, I think it is sometimes when something gets really hot, too many people come in and no one's really solving a unique set of problems. Okay, and hopefully this slide should be no surprise to you, but this was some data collated from a bunch of different influencers and analysts and VCs, and you see at the top, big new trends like virtual reality, like wearables, cybersecurity is a really, really kind of hot space across Europe and especially in London. But you see now, other more established sectors like IoT, fintech, e-commerce. People are probably, they're still looking for opportunities, but they're probably a little less bullish in terms of excitement in those spaces. Cool, so I've talked a bit about sectors. It's easy to talk about finance, it's easy to talk about property, but what we see is these really valuable companies are quite often born when you see shifts in different facilitators. So it might be a different technology, it might be a different set of demographics that are coming through, or a different way of doing business. Just to call a few out, you look at the sharing economy, all of a sudden something like Airbnb, sets that trend, and then you have a whole range of, Airbnb for X, where that model gets applied to a bunch of different industries. And I think what we're seeing in 2016, and it's getting to the point of maybe being a bit overhyped, but artificial intelligence and machine learning, that technology is now just coming to the point where it can be very useful and used across a bunch of different sectors. So, legal, I think, is a really good example of this, where all of a sudden you have artificial intelligence being able to replicate a lot of the things that might need to be done in the legal sector. So all of a sudden you can create a company that probably 2 years ago either wasn't possible or would have been way too early to market. So this is how we look at it, really looking at both sectors and then matching it up with the current trends for us to try and spot where the next billion-dollar company is going to come from. So some examples in the CCAMP portfolio. So you have a property partner where, taking the crowdfunding and sharing economy lessons of platforms like Funding Circle, and all the different P2P lending platforms, but applying that to property. Or we have Reinfer, where we backed those guys very early on. They came out of UCL, they had PhDs in machine learning, they were very technically bright, and actually the big job for them was to say, okay, great, we have this technology, we have this facilitator, but where are we actually going to point that laser? What problem are we going to solve? And they felt that e-commerce was the place that they were going to tackle first. And then lastly, virtual reality, which is a topic and a sector that I'm very excited about. It's still quite early, but our first bet was with a company out of Berlin called Splash VR, where they're using virtual to really disrupt the way that we connect with each other socially. Cool, okay, so that's a bit about the sectors. When you think about where we're actually hunting, which countries and which regions do we think that we're going to find some of these unicorns. If you look at the history, just to kind of rewind a bit, this was some great numbers. If you're interested in this topic, there was a great report last year by G.P. Bullhound, and they put some numbers together and found that there are now over 40 of these so-called unicorns in Europe. I think actually the delta between the year before and the current year was 13 companies, so it's a trend that's accelerating. Some may argue that that's a result of valuations and too much froth in the market, but I think it's still an encouraging trend. Just to put that against the US, I think the numbers were something like 22 new companies entering the $1 billion club in 2015. So we're still a bit behind the US, but actually I think in Europe, valuations are more sensible. The companies are built on, hopefully on very kind of solid backgrounds. So I think it's a very promising landscape that we have. Okay, so where specifically do they come from? Well, this slide probably comes as no surprise, but you can definitely see a couple of clusters that stand out. So all across Europe, we have individual countries that are still producing unicorns. So there's no, okay, I need to be here, I need to be there. But you just have to look at the numbers. You have someone like, London, probably no surprise. You have, very valuable kind of existing businesses that are there for disruption. You have a lot of talent. You have a lot of international people that want to come and build businesses from London. But meanwhile, in Berlin, you have a slightly different flavour. So, in my experience of Berlin, this is a great environment for a creative business. So you can see why something like SoundCloud can build a global business but have Berlin as its base. And it's a great, for the type of people that we needed to hire, it was perfect. We had a lot of top talent from the US saying, hey, I want to relocate my family to Berlin and join this company. But on the other hand, you have the, the kind of the German rigor and process that can then, produce something like Rocket Internet, which is, taking a very different approach to systematically building very valuable businesses. And in between that, again, I think Sweden is a really good example. You know, they take what they're very good at. You know, they historically built big brands like H&M and IKEA. They have, you know, the ability to say, well, actually, we can't build a market just for our market, so they have to be global from day one. And I think that's really important to have. It's, again, it can be quite binary. If you're, you know, if you're in Croatia and you're building just a local product, well, that might be all right for the first 3 months as you validate what your idea is. But at some point here in Europe, the market just isn't big enough to sustain a very, very big business. So you need to be thinking global from day one. Cool, just some numbers to back this up. So it's my belief that these hubs are becoming increasingly important. So back in 2011, we saw about a third of the overall capital invested into new companies was out of the hubs of London, Stockholm, Berlin, Paris and Moscow. That's actually leaped up, so now you look at it in 2015, and that number's getting closer to nearly half of the capital. And I think that's a trend that's probably going to continue. Again, there's lots of very, very smart investors and smart VCs cropping up in local markets, so I think it's fine to start in those countries, but the message really here is for a founder here, take someone like TransferWise, you know, they can build in Estonia, they can, you know, take the experience from Skype and the engineering talent that they have, but at some point you're probably going to need to come to one of the hubs and then use that as a springboard as you continue to grow the business. Okay, and then actually looking at some of the investment numbers, these have probably changed a little bit since I first put this slide together, but overall the message here is that, especially in some of these hubs, the amount of capital available is still growing. So, you know, in a way, the last year or so has not been a better time to be an entrepreneur. In London, we see a lot of early stage funds, but then we're also seeing later stage funds like BGF and Felix being created. I think that is one thing that will probably have to change. One thing I would love to see more of is many more growth funds being able to provide the growth capital. So companies can actually get seeded and get funded first in Europe, but can continue to be funded in Europe as they continue their journey. What we're seeing now is that the United States, you know, like it or not, the United States is still very, very important. I've just pulled up a couple of examples here. You know, speaking from my own experience at SoundCloud, we were like, okay, we're in Berlin, but when we went and raised Series A, you know, one of the things was we had Index, who were a great European-based VC, but we really wanted to have Union Square on board to have a springboard into the US. And that came, with that came a commitment to very early on actually send some people on the ground, set up an office and really establish ourselves. And I think this is really important, you know, for any local fans. If I look at BuildCon and TruckTrack, I think they were very bold in saying, right, okay, you know, we're actually going to make that leap early and see how it plays out. So I think that's something that I'd encourage everyone here to do. At CCAP, we try and take our companies out to the US at least twice a year, to Boston, San Francisco, New York, at least to figure out, you know, does what I'm building resonate here? Is it ready to, you know, think about US as a market, and should I be raising funds out here today? Cool, and I think the last thing that I'm going to talk about is the generational effect, which I think is something which is, you know, slightly more subtle, because it's not like headline news, it's something that you see seep into the ecosystem. And Europe still is, you know, I've written one generation behind, but you could probably argue that we're a couple of generations behind. But you know, time is the cure for that, and I think we're already seeing this. As soon as you have a big, you know, valuable company like Skype being built and then exiting, all of a sudden the effect of that is you suddenly recycle a whole load of great stuff back into your local ecosystem. So, you know, from Skype you've seen, you know, money, so experienced operators who are now willing to back the next generation and also to mentor the next generation of entrepreneurs. But you also have, you know, the recycling of ambition. You know, those people have seen, you know, that it's possible to build a really big company, and they know how to do it. And it also comes with existing networks, which is so crucial for the founders. So I think, you know, the generation effect, as we look for unicorns across Europe, you know, actually looking at, you know, some of these companies as they, you know, someone like a Spotify, as they, you know, move closer towards IPO, as, you know, some of the early staff start to leave, you know, I'm sure that we'll be seeing big things and new kind of like mafias springing up within those companies. But to end on I don't want to end on a negative note. I think the environment here for growing unicorns is extremely good, and I think everyone feels extremely positive. There is still a lot of way to go to catch up to the US. So if you look at the numbers, if you take the market cap of Facebook, it actually totals more than the value of all the 40 unicorns in Europe that I referenced earlier. And I think I think this is changing, but I think it's tempting to see Europe as one kind of fragmented market. That needs to consolidate, and I think also VCs across the whole region. So like with a Truck Track or a Buildcom, where they're able to look into raising money locally, then also have someone like Seacamp in London, but also find investors in the US. So if you can have that combination, then I think the future is looking pretty bright. Cool. So if you are one of the founders who put your hand up, definitely find me later on. I'd love to hear a bit more about what you're working on and how you're finding it starting a business from here. If anyone wants to reach out, I'm at Haynes_Dave on Twitter, or you can email me at Dave@Seacamp. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. We have a few questions for you, and we'll take a few questions from the audience. So you said a really heartbreaking thing when you said, no, it was actually great. That's a great springboard for advice. You said that being early is just as bad as being wrong. Do you have any advice for the audience on how to bridge that, how to get your timing sort of in line with the success that you want to achieve?
Yeah. I mean, I think there is no magic answer. I mean, timing is there's an element of luck in it, and I think as an entrepreneur, you have to sometimes create your own luck. But I would say, I mean, if you look at something like VR, for example, so it's pretty clear. You have Facebook, you have Microsoft, you have Sony. They're all going big in VR. I think everyone's pretty sure it's going to be a game changer, and that there's going to be big companies being built. But if you're an entrepreneur, you might have already been working in this space for a year and a half, but you can't make any revenue, right? No, still nobody's actually got one of these devices, or very few people have got these devices. So I think as an entrepreneur, the question of timing has to partly be a gut feel, but it also, you have to be very tenacious. You have to think, okay, well, if this is what's going to happen, I either need to go out and convince somebody else of my vision and go and fundraise, find someone with deep pockets to fund you through that timing bridge. Or you need to just scrap. I mean, a lot of the guys in the VR space, they're making money from consulting whilst they wait for the market. So they're like, okay, well, I can't get funding through consumers, but I can go to brands and build an experience. And actually, I had a great story from a company called Last.fm, which was one of the big success stories that came out of Europe in the last 10 years. And the founders said when they built Last.fm, they were near to death. Like, people just hadn't hopped on to the fact that you could stream music through your computer. It was just, they were too early, but they plugged away. They were literally sleeping in tents on their roof, and finally they got to that tipping point where the market was ready for them, and they carried on.
Thank you so much. I know we're getting close to lunch, so I'd like to go ahead and take questions from the audience. Does anybody have a question for Dave? This gentleman in the fourth row, blue shirt.
You were talking about the SoundCloud and how it was important for you to have talent already in Berlin. You could hire or eventually get them to get to Berlin. For Montenegrin startups, that could be a problem because sometimes we could lack some talent and we don't sometimes have infrastructure to actually bring people here with their families and everything. So, do you have experience with companies that have workforce that is globally distributed, like Automatic or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, actually, so at SoundCloud, a couple of years in, we actually acquired a company in Bulgaria, so they've been working out in Bulgaria. And what they've been able to do is really take the best from their local market. So they had a team of extremely talented engineers working on a specific problem. So I think you just need to look at what's unique to you. I mean, if I take the example of Truck Track, what they had was they were able to attract engineers willing, if you hire an engineer in New York or London, it's going to cost you a lot of money. If you have a network here, then you can probably take that same team and last a little bit longer. But with Truck Track, they also have the expertise in the trucking industry, and that is a family business. So I think you have to take what's good from your home market. But at some point, you will need other talent, you'll need more visibility, you'll need more access to markets. And I think there it's about building out a proof of concept, or validating what you're doing here, and then just going, getting on a plane, going to Berlin, going to London, going to the Silicon Valley, and just convincing someone else that your idea is great. And you might have to, if you're a founder and you're building a business here, I think you're going to have to accept but one day you might have to move your family away. So.
Do we have any more questions? So, gentleman in the fifth row.
Hi. So, is there any difference when it comes to exit strategies between EU-based European VC funds and US-based funds?
Yeah, I mean, so the question was, is there a difference between European?
I mean, via IPOs or strategic buy, selling the company to a strategic buyer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is still a kind of structural problem that we have in Europe for those investors and for founders. And another reason why you might actually want to get out to the US quite early, but we don't have the big kind of acquisitive companies here in Europe that traditionally are buying companies at creative returns, for the parties involved. So, we don't have a Facebook, we don't have an Amazon, we don't have a Microsoft. But I think we're still seeing, I mean, in London, SwiftKey, they just sold to Microsoft. There's a bunch of companies that are now looking to acquire companies here in Europe. It's much easier if you're close to those people, if you're hanging out in the same places where those deals are happening. It's going to be much easier for you. But yeah, I think over time we might see some big, like if you look at fintech, then you all of a sudden start to bring different types of acquirers. So BBVA Bank, for example, or in like property, you have some very large established businesses here in Europe who probably have money on the balance sheet and want to invest in innovation and new technology.
I think we have time for one more. Gentleman right there.
Excuse me, I'm from Germany and I have made the experience that what comes first, money or talent. So the guys from the Software Brothers in Germany, they created a great story about great talent in Berlin, acquired in unbelievable much money. This money flew to Berlin and finally talent from all over the world came to Berlin to work with that money. So I was walking around yesterday in Budva and I saw these tremendous real estate investments here. So if this guy who is investing all that money in the real estate would invest that into startups here in Budva, we will have the same thing in Budva like you have in Berlin. Because the talent comes running after the money. So what comes first, talent or money?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. There's no right or wrong answer to that. I mean, I know here locally there are some, we are starting to see some new funds that are being created. And I think also as, some of the entrepreneurs come back into local markets, they're also bringing money. But it's, I think you probably can't separate the two. Obviously, talent needs money, and money isn't going to back it's something which doesn't have talent. So I think it's those two really go hand in hand. And hopefully, here you'll see, you already have some great talent, if you can find money. And I think one thing I would say, it's not just about money, it's also about the right sort of money. So we have seen, companies in, slightly less mature markets in, Southern Europe, for example, where there is money, but it's from a different type of investor. If you're a real estate investor, you have a much different expectation of what the returns are. You have different experience to them. So I would caution founders with saying, even when there's money available, whether it's locally or somewhere else, think about what the motivation of that money is and how it can help the business beyond just the check.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.